Okay, we're back at it here with Makers Machining. I'm Tim, and we're at Bert and Art's Pattern Shop, and they have all their machinery in here, and most of the machines are big industrial grade machines that run on three-phase electricity. One of our earlier clips was talking about how to run three-phase electricity. If you don't have it in your building, you get a phase converter, which is what he's got right here. So he's going to turn that thing on, and now his 220 single phase is converted into 220 three phase. He's got some pretty heavy equipment in here that runs on three phase, and here he's got a nice lathe job going on here. So we're gonna see that thing spinning around there. This is not a necessarily a hand finished lathe, but he's got the cross slide and the compound on the lathe there to cut the angles and different shapes. He'll still do some work with turning and getting radii on there, and I see he's got a template there that he's made, so he's got the ability to match up different shapes with what he's got. But that thing there's what, about 3 feet long, Bert? Maybe a little bit longer?
Yeah.
And he's got all these shapes.
Take this off and put this on.
Oh yeah, he's got a tool rest for a manual turning operation. There's all his lathe tools right there. You know what the names of all those different tools are?
I used to.
Gouges and
Gouge.
chisel points, and I'm not sure what all the different names are.
Round point.
Round point.
Yep. Flat. Scraper.
Bert, how long have you been making patterns?
60 years.
60 years. That's pretty good.
Maybe a little longer.
Maybe a little
Small
longer.
gouge.
Yeah. Now you guys might be thinking right now that parting tool. Yep. You guys might be thinking right now about this is some pretty crazy stuff that you got to figure out how to make a core.
Toothing iron.
Oh, what's it called?
It's called a toothing iron.
Toothing iron. Oh yeah, it's got little teeth in there.
Yeah.
But these pattern makers here now, Bert's making this spindle for a fence, and he's got a big flange. He was explaining to me on the end here. He's got this piece that's going to be a bronze casting, and this big flange on here is going to be part of the core pad or core print, because he wants to make a core box where he can put make this thing hollow so it doesn't weigh so much, because the foundry sells you the casting based on weight, and there's a lot of outside dimensions on this thing here that are big, and it would be quite costly for a solid casting, so they put a core in there to create a hollow in there. So he's gonna leave this. He's not quite done with it, but he's gonna get this flange and this end over here, so they can use that as a support for this core that goes in there, because it's gonna be sticking way out into this thing here. So it.
This is actually a split job.
Oh, it's two halves,
when
huh?
I take it out of the lathe, it's held together. This board goes all the way through to here.
Okay.
And this is holding it together.
All right. So this is the split casting
split
like we
job
saw
all the way
before.
through.
Yeah, there's probably a couple of pins somewhere in the middle of this.
Yeah, and there's also a screw temporarily that'll be plugged afterwards.
Oh yeah, okay.
But these boards and that, it runs all the way through the job.
Okay.
And then I make pie segments for halfway, and then notch it out to fit over the board.
How about that? Bert's had some interesting projects, as well as Art, about things that they've made in the past. You can see over there on the table there's a head for what is that, about a 1912 engine of some sort?
Maybe even earlier. Could be
1910 engine. So they're in the process of making patterns and cores for this engine block here. You can see
antique cars.
Yeah, antique cars. That's kind of their niche in making things, although they have done some other things as well. You can see there's a 2 cylinders here, and as Bert was saying, if somebody wanted a 2-cylinder car or a 4-cylinder, then they put 2 of those, or even a 6-cylinder, they'd line these things up. But you can see down inside here all the holes and cavities. This is a water-cooled engine block, and all these valve stem holes and everything, you need to have a core inside there to create that water jacket. So you got to look at these things inside out to figure out what they are. Here's a lot of other shapes, and there's the cylinder walls. Can we set this up a little higher maybe? Oops. Those are the cylinders that the pistons ride up and down. And you can see all these other open areas here for coolant probably, or radiator fluid to cool that thing off. So anyhow, this is the sample. So you guys are, I take it, making a pattern to replicate this.
We have probably made maybe a half a dozen or more.
Okay.
For different cars.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they do a lot of work with different old cars and even racing cars. We're going to go over and talk to Art here in a few minutes. He's got some parts they've made for Indy cars and sprint cars, so you can kind of relate to that.
I've made a lot of castings pretty often, Hauser engine, for a guy that rebuilds Indy race cars.
Really? So that's museum quality stuff that these guys work on, and you know, just all the replicas of whatever somebody needs. They can't go to the auto parts store and buy these things, so they have to make them. So anyhow, Bert's got some of his layout information here. This is a little bit smaller than the one that's in the lathe, so he's got his layout there.
That one over here.
Okay, we have the one in the lathe on the other table.
2 feet. The other one is 30 inches.
Okay, 2 feet and 30 inches. He's got his other layout over here. If you look at all this, you got some of his tools here. These are some measuring. I guess it's a caliper, maybe you would call it, measuring caliper,
yeah.
And trammel points and dividers. It's really interesting how these guys can construct their drawings and get the shapes. Then they might make a template that they can use to follow a pattern to shape the pattern, I guess you could say. But you know, here's the old protractor and a ruler and shrink rules and everything else that you need. So there's a lot of different things that go into it. It's a true craftsman that can build patterns like these guys do. So my hat's off to you, Bert and Art, for the work that you guys do here. We're going to take a walk over here by Art for a minute. He's got some patterns he wants to show us in cores. So we'll see what he's got over here. You've got a couple of Cadillac motors here. Is that what these are?
Well, these are 2 cylinder barrels for 1910 Cadillac.
Okay.
And here is the pattern that I have made to reproduce these. And once again, like Bert was saying, this is a split pattern. Comes apart for molding purposes. And this one requires 7 core boxes to make. These are core prints that locate the core for the cylinder bore. There's the core box. And this is the cylinder bore. And they'll make 2 of these, paste them together, set them in the mold, and the other core boxes, these for example, will go under here because these ears stick out and would trap sand, so they couldn't get the pattern out of the mold. So I had to put core prints here and make core boxes that will draw out of the sand.
Okay. So there's all kinds of different little things you got to take into consideration, because you can put your mold in, your pattern into the mold, but you got to be able to take it out without damaging the shape of the cavity that you're trying to make.
And then, as you can see here, there's a recessed lip around here. On this particular engine, this is actually the water jacket cooling area. They spin a copper cover or shell that'll sit on here and come down around. So the outside of this cylinder will have a shiny copper water jacket on it that gets attached to the base here. So it makes for a beautiful engine. This, of course, will be painted. This will be polished copper. And then this is just the cylinder. The cylinder head, which is a separate casting, will get bolted onto the top of this. And these 2 core boxes go right here, and they core out this little groove.
You can see these are used cylinders, and you can see how pitted they are from having water go through them all the time.
And that's the main reason these have to be replaced. Now this one, for example, is so filled with rust, the water comes in here, goes around, and comes up through 2 little grooves. Well, on this one, those grooves are just filled with rust. so water could not get into this cylinder. And
Heat is not a good thing when you've got an engine running.
yeah, and it takes 4 of these to make an engine. And these 4 cylinder barrels will be bolted to a common aluminum crankcase.
They had aluminum castings back in those days?
Oh yes, back in the late 1800s.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Of course, the aluminum today is much better.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And,
well, like any of the other materials that we use for anything these days, the technology has brought a lot of good alloys to use.
Well, for example, in the early days, a Simplex was a very expensive car. In fact, today the people who own them are almost like a cult. And they had aluminum transmissions. And the aluminum in those transmissions was so bad that they're all breaking. So several years ago I made a pattern for that. And I think now virtually every Simplex existing has a new transmission made out of aircraft.
Yeah, but they had to use something better that would hold up.
Right.
Yeah. And now those cars are on like show cruises around the country and in museums and things like that. They're not daily.
The beautiful people own those cars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What else have you got here? These beautiful blue patterns
let's
here.
start right here.
Okay. We got about 3-4 minutes left on this this clip here, so we'll take a look at this.
This is an aluminum air intake pipe for a 91 cubic inch Miller sprint car. This bolts to the supercharger. The carburetor bolts and hangs down here. And now once again, this is for a 91 cubic inch car. This is the same part, but it's for a 122 cubic inch Miller Indy car. And this is the pattern that you use. And of course, a pattern has to be split at a parting line so you can get the mold apart to get the pattern out and to set the core. And so you can see on a piece that's round, obviously the parting would be right here in the center. So I had to make a parting block so this thing would sit in the sand to help the foundry mold it. And they mold it this half first. They take the whole thing, tip it over, and then they take this out. So the only thing in the sand is this part. Then they'll mold the other half, set the core in. The core is made in this core box, and they can either fill this with sand halfway and then paste the 2 halves together, or they can put the core box together and blow the sand in. And you can see that this part fits directly and tightly over this part.
Isn't that a perfect
and that's
fit?
The core box.
And you used 3/16 spacers in between the actual part and the core box, so your wall thickness would be consistent throughout.
Consistent 3/16 of an inch, correct?
Yep. Okay. Well, that's pretty neat to see all this. You can see all the different colors here. You've got what's red used for in foundries? What do they consider that as?
Well,
like cast iron or?
Well, in the old days they used to have color coding. Every color meant something different. In the old days, a red pattern meant an aluminum casting.
Oh, okay.
A cast iron casting, the pattern would be black with yellow core prints. And it was just an easy way for the foundry to quickly identify what kind of material. But I think that's kind of gone by the wayside. So,
Yeah. Take a look at the craftsmanship here in making this block, and how everything fits together, and the core box over there fits together. There's no seams. These guys really can do a good job. It's just so adept with handwork and hand fitting things. It's amazing.
then I think we should take a look at that.
Okay.
Coping
We're gonna start another little section here after this one, so we'll be back to you here in a minute.